Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to this special 5-part podcast series sponsored by Affiliated Monitors, which celebrates Affiliated Monitors' 15 years in business as the first entity specializing in independent integrity monitoring. Founded in 2004, Affiliated Monitors provides independent integrity monitoring and ethics and compliance assessments nationally and internationally and across almost all industries. With its knowledge of effective ethics and compliance programs and cultures, Affiliated Monitors is respected for its work as the corporate monitor on matters ranging from multinational corporations to small and mid-sized companies and even individuals. Having served in nearly 750 monitorships, no one has more experience as an independent monitor than the team at Affiliated Monitors. For more information on how an independent monitor can help improve your company's ethics and compliance programs, visit this podcast series sponsor, Affiliated Monitors, at www.affiliatedmonitors.com. In this 5-part series, I visit with Jesse Kaplan, the Managing Director of Corporate Oversight at Affiliated Monitors, in a series on emerging issues in healthcare compliance and independent monitoring. We take up the opioid crisis, focusing on prescribing opioids, regulatory and compliance risks, the identifying and mitigating risk around opioid prescribing. We consider the expanded use of an independent monitor in healthcare regulatory situations. Then we take a look at it from the independent integrity monitoring of healthcare organizations and systems. And finally, we conclude with using independent integrity assessments and monitoring to limit adverse consequences of compliance violations. This 5-part series is sponsored by Affiliated Monitors, and it is a special presentation of the Compliance Podcast Network. In our prior episode, we considered how independent monitoring can serve important public policy goals in the healthcare industry. In this episode 4, we discuss examples of independent monitoring involving healthcare organizations or systems going forward. Hello, everyone. Tom Fox back again with Jesse Kaplan, Managing Director of Corporate Oversight at Affiliated Monitors. In episode 4 of our 5-part exploration of emerging issues in healthcare compliance and monitoring. Today, we take up the issue of independent integrity monitoring of healthcare organizations and systems. Jesse, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So, Jesse, in some prior episodes, you explained, or rather gave us examples of healthcare regulatory agencies, State Department of Health imposed independent monitoring requirements on hospitals who had patient safety issues. Today, I wanted to see if you could speak a little bit more about how healthcare organizations and the agencies that regulate them are using monitoring in connection with significant business transactions as opposed to the cudgel of a law enforcement or even disciplinary proceedings.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Tom. So, healthcare transactions like acquisitions, mergers, nonprofit conversions, and even capital improvements by hospitals and hospital systems are subject to regulatory oversight and scrutiny that may be more intense than in other industries. For example, major capital improvements to hospitals are often subject to a state certificate of need or determination of need approval. Not-for-profit hospitals that seek to convert to for-profit, often as part of a merger or acquisition transaction, are likely to face scrutiny and require approval by those agencies that regulate and oversee both their licensing and their charities functions. And typically that's a state Department of Health and a state Attorney General's office. And mergers or acquisitions of hospitals or health insurance companies, or even in some cases physician practices, can be subject to antitrust scrutiny, both by state authorities, like a state Attorney General's office, and possibly federal review by the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission. So in each of these healthcare transactions, the government agencies are not seeking to address compliance violations or the cudgel of a law enforcement action, like you said. But in most of these matters, the healthcare organization, is not doing anything wrong. But these transactions are likely to impact the structure and dynamics of the local healthcare market. And the regulators have both the authority and the objective of ensuring that those impacts are positive for the local healthcare marketplace. The government's healthcare regulators and policymakers will want to ensure that the transaction, number one, improves the quality of healthcare, number two, increases access to healthcare, particularly for people, for vulnerable and underserved communities, and that it does so efficiently. So in order to withstand government review and get the approvals required, the healthcare organizations entering into these types of transactions often offer up representations, they make concessions, they agree to make investments and improvements, all actions designed to address the state's concerns and objectives. And the state regulators themselves will often seek to impose additional conditions or requirements on the transacting healthcare organizations to address the state's public policy objectives. So whenever you have conditions being imposed or being offered as a prerequisite, for approval of a healthcare transaction or a conversion, there's going to be a need to have someone monitoring whether those conditions are being effectively implemented and sustained. So the government agencies could do the monitoring themselves, but as we've discussed in one of the earlier episodes, Tom, that requires resources that are not always readily available to the government agency. So we find that a better alternative will often be that the regulators and the healthcare organizations both agree to an independent monitoring firm to oversee that the conditions, investments, improvements are being timely and effectively implemented. In these matters, the independent monitor, is basically an extender for the government, but is being paid for by the healthcare organization, and may be, one of the linchpins to getting this transaction approved and then consummated.
So, Jesse, I often talk about a business response to compliance, or rather a business response to the laws, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in your field, obviously laws relating to both patient safety and indeed opioid prescription. And it seems to me that this solution you have articulated of an independent monitoring and independent assessment is almost a business solution to a legal problem. And here it's the legal problem of opioid over prescription. But I'm struck of how close or how this is really a market solution to both a legal problem and a business problem. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I've heard you say, good compliance is good business, and I think this is in the same vein. Here in a case where and we're talking, if we're talking specifically about healthcare transactions, here's a situation where the business wants to get these transactions approved. They've agreed to make concessions, but the big issue for the regulator who needs to approve the transaction is how are they going to make sure that the organization follows through. And, if the organization can either propose or at least agree to having an independent monitor take on the responsibility of monitoring that those conditions are going to come to fruition and report to the government, that can provide the comfort to the government agency to approve the transaction, that way they have comfort that they're looking out for the public interest, and it also could be then the means by how these organizations can get that transaction approved and then consummated. Hope that answers your question.
It does, Jesse. And the other thing that struck me is having heard you on several podcasts now talk about an independent monitor in the healthcare arena. It's not simply there to represent the regulator. The independent monitor is there to assess. The independent monitor is there to perhaps make recommendations and help the company move towards not only complying with whatever rule and regulation that may be the issue, but also helping them to have a more robust compliance program in place in all areas of healthcare.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm going to kind of give an example of kind of the business benefit to organizations. So, for instance, we're seeing the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission using independent monitors in approving major transactions that might otherwise not get approved or be deemed problematic issues. So, for instance, in the recent acquisition or merger of CVS and Aetna, which probably read about that occurred last year, the Department of Justice approved the merger of CVS and Aetna, but required that there be certain divestitures of business of Aetna's. In fact, it was Aetna's Medicare individual prescription drug plan business, but in order to ensure that divestiture would occur as contemplated and would result in an effective competitive alternative to the merged entity, the Department of Justice required that CVS and Aetna engage a independent monitor, what they called a monitoring trustee, to make sure that divestiture went through as contemplated, as I mentioned. And so, obviously, this was a very big, and it still hasn't yet been approved, as far as I understand, the merger. But in order to get that approved, the DOJ, required this independent monitoring or monitoring trustee. And if that works out, this will be a major business, success for the merged entities, as well as for the public interest.
I see monitoring we've talked about it really from the business perspective, and you've certainly talked about it from the conversion or transactional arena. But how about if we brought in, what would be the impact of an independent monitor just to come in and do an assessment for a corporation that just wants to see sort of where they are at this point with their own policies and procedures?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we probably need more time than we have for this episode to talk a lot about it. But yeah, we're doing more and more what we call proactive assessments of the ethics and compliance programs of organizations, and particularly in the healthcare field. And what that does is it provides a company with an independent, basically kicking of the tires of their program. We're often engaged underprivileged, so it really is confidential. It's really just for the company's benefit, and it can help them then identify both, as I mentioned, the strengths, but also the gaps in their ethics and compliance program. And if they then remediate those gaps, they're in good shape if and when there's a compliance problem that occurs or a compliance violation that occurs in the future. And the idea there is they hopefully will be able to then persuade a regulator that when they do have a compliance violation, that violation is a one-off. It might be a rogue employee, and it is not indicative of any problems with their ethics and compliance program. In fact, if they can tell the regulator, we had an independent third party come in, look at our compliance program, make recommendations, we've addressed those recommendations, and therefore, if we had a problem, it's not, you can be lenient with us because we actually have a strong culture of compliance and a strong program, and we've had cases where organizations have used those independent assessments to just that purpose and with a successful outcome.
So, Jesse, unfortunately, we're near the end of our time, but I asked you that question because I want to set up tomorrow's fifth and final podcast, which is using independent integrity assessments and monitoring to limit the adverse consequences of a compliance violation. And as you suggest, we're going to take a deeper dive into it in a separate episode. So I look forward to continuing the conversation in our next episode.
Sounds great. Thanks, Tom.
This is Tom Fox. I hope you enjoyed this episode in our 5-part exploration of emerging issues in healthcare compliance and independent monitoring. Also, I hope you will check out our sponsor's website, www.affiliatedmonitors.com. I hope you will join us again for another episode. This 5-part podcast series on emerging issues in healthcare compliance and independent monitoring is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.